Nurse handed my baby to a stranger, but she refused to give him back. I'd been in labor for 31 hours. When Liam finally came out screaming, they let me hold him for 10 seconds. 10 seconds. Then a nurse whisked him away, to the NICU. My husband Jake went with him. He came back white as a sheet. Some woman is holding our baby. I ripped my IV out. The hallway between the maternity ward and the NICU smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, and my hospital gown was open in the back. And I did not care about any of that. I was barefoot on polished linoleum, trailing a blood pressure cuff from my left wrist, moving at a speed that no nurse on that floor had apparently anticipated from a woman who had been in active labor 6 minutes ago. The overhead lights buzzed at a frequency I could feel in my back molars. The corridor stretched longer than it should have. Everything was the pale yellow of old institutions, of places built in the 1970s and never quite renovated. And the door to the NICU had a keypad on it that Jake had somehow gotten through already. And he was standing in the doorway with his hand pressed flat against the frame, not holding it open for me, holding himself up. I pushed past him. There were 14 incubators in that room. I know that now. I counted them later in the way that you catalog the details of a bad experience, because cataloging keeps your hands busy. I didn't count them then. Then I saw one thing. A woman in the third chair from the left, positioned beneath the warming lamp, a hospital-issue blanket draped across her front. She was brunette, mid-30s, wearing a gown that matched mine. She had the look of someone performing Serenity, chin lifted, spine straight, the particular stillness of a person who has decided how they want to appear in a moment they have been imagining for a long time. She was breastfeeding my son. I knew it was Liam because he had Jake's birthmark, a small dark patch on his left shoulder, same spot, same shape as the one Jake has carried his entire life, the one his mother calls his map, because she used to say every good navigator needs one. I had spent the first trimester quietly terrified that Liam wouldn't have it. I had spent the third trimester quietly certain he would. The morning of my due date, 2 weeks before Liam arrived, I had put my hand on my stomach and told him that I already knew what he looked like. I was right. I'd known him before I met him. That's our baby, I told the head nurse. She smiled like I was a child throwing a tantrum. Honey, the wristband says otherwise. Then she pulled the blanket up over Liam's shoulder. She's just jealous, Dana said loud enough for the whole ward to hear. Her baby's uglier. The head nurse told us to calm down or she'd call security. Jake didn't calm down. They called security. 2 guards walked him out while Dana watched from her chair, rocking my son like she'd earned him. That image, her chin lifted, the practiced rock of the chair, the corner of her mouth still turned up. That was the image I held on to for the next 3 days. Not because it broke me, because it was the thing I kept returning to when I needed to remember exactly what I was dealing with. Jake and I had met in the biology department at Ohio State, which matters because when you meet someone in a biology lab, you spend your early relationship arguing about evolutionary theory and the ethical treatment of fruit flies. And what you do not anticipate is that any of those early, earnest conversations will one day feel prophetic. We moved to Columbus permanently after graduation. Jake took a job in environmental consulting. I went into hospital administration, which is a detail I will return to. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment near Grandview for 3 years before we bought the house. A 1940s craftsman in Clintonville with a porch that needed repainting and a backyard that needed everything. We painted it yellow. The porch? We spent an entire October weekend doing it while the neighbors' kids raked leaves across the street. And I thought idly that this was the kind of Saturday I'd been aiming for my whole life. We weren't people who expected to be tested the way we were tested. That is not a moral judgment about our readiness or our character. It is just a fact about the difference between the life you build and the life that arrives. The pregnancy had not been simple. We'd lost a previous pregnancy at 14 weeks, a Tuesday in February, the kind of cold that seeps through window frames. And the subsequent 6 months had involved a specialist in Dublin, Ohio, 2 additional monitoring appointments per week, and a medication regimen that required a laminated chart on the refrigerator. I knew my own chart better than most nurses on my floor did, because I had been in hospital administration long enough to know that you are your own best advocate, and I had learned that the hard way at a previous job, which is a skill, not a paranoia, though people who've never needed it tend to call it paranoia. When I was admitted at 39 weeks and 4 days, I brought a typed list of preferences for my birth team. I introduced myself to every nurse on shift. I asked about the NICU's standard intake protocol because Liam's position in the final weeks had flagged a possible cord complication, and I wanted to know the handoff procedure. The handoff procedure was a wristband, an ink-stamped paper wristband on a newborn's ankle that gets matched to the mother's matching band. Standard, simple, resistant to almost everything except a wristband error on the intake nurse's part. The intake nurse made an error. We learned this later, from the hospital's own internal report, which I obtained through channels I will describe in their proper order. The error was not malicious. On the nurse's part, she had come off a double shift. She was processing 2 NICU admissions simultaneously, mine and Dana's. The babies arrived in the ward within 4 minutes of each other. The wristbands, according to the report, were prepared correctly and then set down on the same intake surface. And in the chaos of 2 simultaneous admissions, one was placed on the wrong ankle. 4 minutes. One surface, a double-shifted nurse. That was the mechanism. What happened next was not a mechanism. What happened next was a choice. The blood test took 3 days. 3 days of Dana posting photos on Instagram. My Christopher, my miracle boy. She'd already filed a birth certificate, already named him, already written a caption about how her heart had never been so full. 3 days of me going home with a baby that wasn't mine, a baby I couldn't look at, couldn't hold without shaking, because every second I spent with him was a second someone else had Liam. The baby we brought home was named Christopher by Dana's paperwork, and he cried the way all newborns cry, which is to say constantly and without discrimination. And I sat in the rocking chair in the nursery we had painted a warm cream color, and I held him and I fed him because he was a baby and he needed to eat. And Jake sat on the floor next to the chair and neither of us spoke very much. There are no good words for that room in those 3 days. I have not gone looking for them. The results came back. Liam was ours. Genetically, legally, undeniably ours. Dana said no. Her lawyer filed an emergency custody petition. Psychological bonding. 4 days old and she was claiming psychological bonding. The hospital administrator, a woman named Carol, called it a complex situation and suggested we consider visitation arrangements. Visitation. With my own son. Carol actually said it with a straight face, sitting behind her big desk with photos of her own children smiling down from the shelf behind her. She wore a blazer the color of dried sage, and she had the particular energy of someone who had spent 20 years learning to say difficult things in a tone that implied the difficulty was mutual. Her desk was mahogany. Real mahogany, not laminate. I noticed because I had spent 9 years in hospital administration and I knew what that desk cost and I knew who paid for it. She folded her hands and said the words psychological bonding the way someone says inclement weather, as though it were a natural force, as though no one were responsible for the conditions that produced it. I looked at her hands, I looked at the photos on her shelf, I looked at the small framed cross-stitch on the wall behind her left shoulder that said something about grace. I thanked her for her time and I left. That was a Thursday at 2:14 in the afternoon. I was back at my own desk by 3 o'clock. I had been in hospital administration for 9 years. I had processed incident reports. I had sat in on risk management reviews. I had watched the internal machinery of a large medical institution respond to a crisis, and I had a fairly precise understanding of when that machinery was working to solve a problem and when it was working to contain one. Carol's office was containment. The mahogany desk was containment. The suggestion of visitation arrangements was the institution pre-positioning itself for the lawsuit it expected us to file, softening the relationship before the filing, making us feel heard so that our attorneys would have a harder time arguing we'd been stonewalled. I was not going to file the lawsuit they were expecting. I was going to do something else first. That's when Dana's sister cracked. Her name was Renee. I had not known she existed until she messaged me through Instagram on the second day, when Dana was posting her 4th photo of Liam. Captioned, "Golden Hour, my whole heart," and Renee had been watching the account the way you watch something that is wrong but that you've been telling yourself is fine, and somewhere between the 3rd and 4th photo, she stopped telling herself it was fine. She sent me screenshots. Pages of them. Dana had spent 3 years in fertility treatments, failed IVF, a divorce. Then she'd used a sperm donor, specifically choosing someone who looked like Jake. Same hair, same build, same listed background. She had been in the delivery suite right next to ours. She'd heard everything through the wall. Our family names, our plans, Jake's job, his mother's lasagna recipe, all of it picked up through shared drywall and the particular acoustics of a hospital corridor where people speak in what they think are quiet voices. When Jake stepped into the hallway and pulled off his bloody shirt, he'd pressed it against a cut from the IV stand during the chaos. She went looking for it on every baby in the NICU. She found Liam before the nurses even noticed the wristband error. She texted her sister from her hospital bed that same night. The text read, "The mix-up is a gift. I deserve this baby more than they do. He's from good genes. Mine was just cheap sperm." In a text message, at 11:47 p.m. on the night he was born. I read that line 4 times. Not because I needed to read it 4 times to understand it, because I needed to confirm that it was real, that I was reading it correctly, that there was no possible interpretive angle from which that sentence became something other than what it was. There wasn't. I screenshot it on my phone, then screenshot the screenshot, then emailed it to myself from 2 different accounts. Then I called Rachel Voss. Rachel was a family law attorney based out of a small office in Bexley, which is the kind of neighborhood where old money and new money have arrived at a mutual understanding. And her office was the ground floor of a Victorian row house with a parking lot that used to be a garden. I had found her name through a friend who had gone through a custody dispute the previous year and described her as the kind of lawyer who does not perform confidence, but simply has it, which was what I needed. She had short gray hair and a preference for unadorned blouses, and the quality of attention that makes you feel, when she is looking at you, that she is already 3 steps ahead of whatever you are about to say. She didn't blink once during the whole story. She filed criminal charges that same afternoon. custodial interference, parental kidnapping. She called a detective named Mark Haynes who specialized in family abductions and arrived at her office 40 minutes later, still wearing jeans from his day off. He had the particular unhurriedness of someone very good at his job, the kind of calm that isn't indifference but is so far past agitation that it reads the same from the outside. He read the screenshots twice, zoomed in on the worst parts. Then he said one word: gold. Rachel pulled a manila folder from her desk drawer, one she had already started in the 2 hours since my call, which I noted. And she slid a legal pad across the desk and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning, in order, with dates wherever you can give them." I talked for 2 hours. She wrote without stopping. When I finished, she tapped the pen twice on the pad and said, "The hospital's going to try to make this a civil matter. We're not going to let them." She was right that they would try. Carol called Jake the next morning at 8 a.m. on the dot, before we'd had coffee, and the call lasted 11 minutes and contained the phrases shared responsibility and complex circumstances, and we'd like to facilitate a resolution at least 4 times each. Jake listened without interrupting, which is one of his better qualities, and when she finished, he said, "Our attorney will be in touch," and hung up. Carol did not call again. Meanwhile, Dana had taken Liam and run. This, Detective Haynes told us later, was the second strategic error she made, the first being the texts. Running transforms a civil dispute, which has timelines and hearings and motions and months, into a criminal matter that moves at an entirely different speed. Rachel had filed that afternoon. By the following morning, a warrant was active. By that evening, Haynes had pinged Dana's phone to a motel 30 miles west of Columbus, just off I-70, a place called the Sunset Inn that had 34 rooms and a parking lot with one security camera aimed at the wrong angle. She didn't stay there long. 48 hours later, the phone signal moved again, 2 hours north to a small suburb outside Cleveland, to a house belonging to a woman named Rebecca, a childhood friend from Dana's hometown. The kind of old friendship that runs deep enough that Rebecca didn't ask many questions when Dana arrived with a newborn and a duffel bag and a story that had clearly been prepared in advance. While Dana was running, we were building. Rachel's office produced, in 4 days, a document package that the Franklin County DA's office later described to a reporter as airtight before breakfast, a phrase that appeared in a Columbus Dispatch piece that ran 6 months after the trial and that I have a printed copy of, folded into thirds, at the back of a desk drawer. That phrase, airtight before breakfast, was not something I'd arranged. It was the DA's own assessment, shared with a journalist, and it referred specifically to the following: the screenshots from Renee, printed chain of custody documented, authenticated by the metadata on the original message files. The Instagram posts time-stamped against the hospital wristband records, a signed statement from the NICU intake nurse who processed the wristband error and who cooperated fully with the investigation because she had not known what Dana had done with the information and was, by all accounts, devastated. The doorbell camera footage from Rebecca's house in the Cleveland suburb, which was a Ring camera and which had captured in high definition Dana's arrival with a newborn, a statement from Renee, who had retained her own attorney by that point and who provided a recorded account of Dana's communications over the preceding weeks, and a set of financial records subpoenaed from Dana's bank account showing she had withdrawn $4,200 in cash from an ATM on the morning of her discharge from the hospital. $4,200 in cash on the morning she was discharged. That was the thing that elevated the evidence from compelling to devastating, because it demonstrated premeditation in financial terms. She had prepared for the possibility of running before she ran, which meant the psychological break her attorneys would later claim was flatly inconsistent with the behavior pattern in the bank records. You do not withdraw $4,200 in cash in a psychological break. You do so in a plan. A warrant went out on a Tuesday. At 5 a.m. Wednesday, police surrounded Rebecca's house in the Cleveland suburb, a split-level ranch with a birch tree in the front yard that was just beginning to bud. I know this because Haynes described it to me afterward, the birch tree specifically, and I don't know why that detail lodged, but it did. Dana screamed when they lifted Liam from her arms. Full performance. Tears clawing at the officers, shrieking about her rights and her bond and her baby. Rebecca's doorbell camera caught every single second of it. They brought Liam to us at the station at 7:43 in the morning. He smelled like someone else's laundry detergent. He had lost almost a pound in 5 days, severely dehydrated. A diaper rash so bad the pediatrician visibly winced during the examination. A physical, involuntary wince, the kind you can't perform, and spoke in the clipped, controlled way of someone choosing their words carefully because the words they actually want to say are not the words appropriate for a police station. Dana had been struggling to establish a milk supply, and rather than seek help, she had supplemented inconsistently, and Liam had not been fed reliably enough in those 5 days to maintain his weight. She had stolen my son and nearly starved him. I held him against my chest in a chair in the corner of the station, and Jake sat on the arm of the chair with his hand on the back of my head, and the pediatrician finished her examination and made her notes. and I did not cry. I want to be precise about that, not because composure is a virtue, but because the absence of tears was not composure. It was something harder to name. It was the particular state of a person who has been running so fast on adrenaline and paperwork and attorney calls and the mechanical management of terror that the ordinary emotional responses have been temporarily rerouted. I cried later in the car in the parking lot of a Kroger on the way home, while Jake pumped gas. I let myself have 3 minutes of it and then I stopped, because Liam was in the car seat and I didn't want the first thing he remembered, which I know is not how infant memory works, but I did not want it anyway, to be his mother crying in a grocery store parking lot. He was home. He was ours. That should have been the end. The trial took 4 months to arrive and 4 days to destroy her. Dana's defense team, 2 attorneys from a Cleveland firm that specialized in family law, which told me something about her preparation even before the trial began, filed 3 motions to suppress before the proceedings started. All 3 were denied, the texts were admitted, the financial records were admitted. The doorbell footage was admitted. The NICU intake nurse testified in a voice that did not waver and with the specific particular grief of someone who has been carrying a mistake they didn't make in the way that matters. Dana wore a soft blue dress on the stand, the color of faded denim, slightly washed out under the courtroom lighting, the kind of choice that says I am gentle without saying it in words. She cried beautifully. She had clearly worked on the crying, not the tears themselves, but the stillness around them, the way she let them fall without reaching up to wipe them, as though she were so overcome she had forgotten the gesture. She talked about infertility, she talked about the failed IVF cycles, the medications, the marriage that did not survive the process. She talked about walking into the NICU and seeing Liam and feeling a recognition she could not explain, a pull, a certainty. She said the word miracle 3 times in 11 minutes. Which I now understand is a technique, not a feeling. The repetition of one high-stakes word until the jury stops noticing they've heard it and starts accepting it as the emotional register of the speaker. Then the prosecutor asked about the texts. Silence. A specific silence, the kind that has a weight and a shape. Dana's attorney leaned slightly forward and then stopped himself, because there was nothing to object to. The texts were in evidence. The question was whether she had sent them. She said she didn't remember sending them. The prosecutor showed her the metadata. Her phone, her number, her account. She said she was in a difficult mental state. The prosecutor asked about the $4,200 withdrawal. The prosecutor asked what, specifically, she had been afraid of. Dana said she had been afraid of losing the baby she had bonded with. The prosecutor asked whether she had made that withdrawal before or after she received the DNA results. Dana paused for 4 seconds, I counted, and said she didn't remember the exact timing. The exact timing was on the bank statement. The withdrawal was made at 9:17 a.m. The DNA results had been transmitted to the hospital at 11:52 a.m. the same day. She had taken the money before she knew the results, which meant she had prepared to run before she knew she would need to. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty, felony custodial interference, child endangerment, 4 years in state prison, permanent restraining order, no contact with our family, ever again. Dana's attorney, a man named Richard Alton, not the senior partner from the Cleveland firm who had quietly reduced his involvement as the evidence mounted, but a junior associate who had been given the unpleasant task of the final stages, stood outside the courthouse and read a prepared statement about appeals and justice and the complexity of a mother's love. And a handful of journalists recorded it, and I was not there to hear it because I was sitting in the parking garage 2 blocks away eating a sandwich Jake had packed that morning, listening to Liam gurgle in his car seat while Rachel sent me a text that said simply, "Unanimous on all counts. Well done." I thought it was over. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 7 months after sentencing. Jake brought it to the kitchen table without opening it, which told me he already knew from the return address what it was going to say. His face went pale before he finished the first paragraph. He slid it across to me without a word. Dana had filed an appeal. New lawyer, not Richard Alton, a different firm, one with a stronger track record in appellate work, which meant someone had been funding the appeal from the start, which meant this had been planned. The new argument centered on ineffective assistance of counsel. Her original attorney had never presented proper expert testimony about her mental state, her postpartum condition, the years of documented infertility treatment, and the psychological impact of those years. The alleged dissociative episode that her new team was now calling a genuine break from reality. The appellate court had agreed to hear it. I sat down on the floor right there in the kitchen. Not dramatically. I didn't fall, I just found the floor more manageable than the chair. The linoleum was cold through my socks, and outside, Liam was in the living room laughing at something on the baby monitor we'd moved out there. Just laughing. The kind of laugh that requires a person to believe, for a moment, that everything is fine because the person laughing is 8 months old and his laughter is evidence of a world in which things can be fine. And Dana's new attorney was already giving interviews outside the appellate courthouse. Rachel called that afternoon. I had already called her. We talked for 47 minutes, and I took notes in the way I had learned to take notes over the previous year, which is to say I wrote down only what mattered and I wrote it in complete sentences, and I dated the page. What Rachel told me was this: an appeal on ineffective assistance grounds is a narrow argument, and the bar is high, and the evidence in this case is not the kind of evidence that disappears under a mental health lens. What the new attorneys were attempting was not unusual. It was a last move by someone who had exhausted the other moves. It was not nothing. She wanted me to understand that it was not nothing, but it was the weakest available argument, and they would prepare for it, and the preparation had already begun. She had already spoken with the DA's office. She had already retained a forensic psychiatrist who had reviewed Dana's treatment records, subpoenaed during the original trial and never fully deployed, and whose conclusions were not favorable to the new narrative of a genuine dissociative break. The financial records, in particular, were inconsistent with dissociation. The careful, premeditated nature of the cash withdrawal, the specific timing relative to the DNA results, the decision to travel to a specific person's house, rather than acting without direction. These were the actions of someone who had lost contact with reality. These were the actions of someone who had planned. The appeal took 11 months. In those 11 months, Liam began walking. He took his first steps on a Sunday in October in the kitchen, holding onto the cabinet door and then letting go, and he made it 4 steps before he sat down hard and looked enormously surprised, the way infants look when their bodies do something they didn't consciously decide. Jake was there. We both were. I have a video of it on my phone, 12 seconds long, and at the end you can hear Jake make a sound that is not quite a word. We celebrated Liam's first birthday on a Saturday in November, in the backyard of the Clintonville house, with Jake's family and my parents and 2 couples from the neighborhood and Renee, who had flown in from Pittsburgh and who stood near the back fence with a paper plate and a plastic cup, and who looked like someone still navigating the particular awkwardness of being the person who did the right thing and is not entirely sure what happens next. We hugged at the door when she arrived, and I didn't say anything adequate, and neither did she. The appellate court denied the appeal on a Wednesday in February. 3 judges. Unanimous. The ruling was 41 pages and described the original trial proceedings as thorough, the evidence as overwhelming, and the ineffective assistance claim as unsupported by the record. That same week, our civil suit against the hospital reached a settlement. The amount is under a confidentiality agreement, but I will say that it covered the legal fees from both the criminal proceeding and the civil one, the medical expenses related to Liam's hospitalization after his return, the dehydration treatment, the follow-up pediatric visits, the specialist consultation, and a figure beyond those expenses that reflected the hospital's recognition of what their intake error had made possible. Carol was not at the settlement meeting. The hospital sent its general counsel, a man named Douglas, who shook my hand firmly and maintained the careful neutrality of someone who has spent his career being professionally sorry without ever actually being sorry. Rachel shook his hand too. She smiled the same way she had smiled the first time I met her, which is to say she did not perform warmth but simply maintained her position, and Douglas, I think, understood what that smile meant. The hospital also implemented a dual verification protocol for all NICU admissions. 2 nurses required to confirm wristband placement simultaneously, with a logged confirmation in the electronic record. Rachel had negotiated that as a non-monetary term. It was not in the settlement amount. It was its own line. That was the thing she was most satisfied about, she told me afterward, over coffee at a place near her office in Bexley that I'd been to so many times over the previous 18 months that the owner knew what I ordered. Rachel drank her coffee black and said, "The money goes to you. The protocol goes to the next family." She said it the way she said most important things, which was once, without elaborating. Dana served 14 months of her 4-year sentence before being released to a supervised halfway house under Ohio's early release framework for nonviolent offenders, which is a policy I have complicated feelings about and which is not the point of this story. The restraining order remained intact through the release. The no contact provision was permanent. Her parental rights to Christopher, the baby who had been brought home by us in those first 3 days, and who had been returned to Dana when Liam was recovered, and who by all accounts was being raised by Dana's mother in a small suburb of Akron in Dana's absence, were under review by the court, a process I did not follow closely because it was not mine to follow. I thought about Christopher sometimes. That is the part of the story that does not resolve cleanly, the part that resists the forward motion of everything else. He was a baby too. He had spent 3 days in our house in the cream-colored nursery, rocked in the chair I had spent 6 months picking out. He hadn't chosen any of this any more than Liam had. I hoped he was being held by someone who knew how to hold him. I hoped he had a good pediatrician. The $4,200 Dana withdrew the morning before the DNA results came in was recovered as part of the criminal judgment. It went back into an account that Rachel had helped us set up. A custodial account for Liam, modest but real, the kind of thing you open because you want the narrative of a terrible thing to produce one small, concrete, forward-facing item. It had earned a little interest by the time I thought to check on it. Not much. We repainted the porch the following spring. Same yellow, second coat, because the first coat had been doing what first coats do on old wood in Ohio winters. Jake did the trim, I did the flat sections. Liam sat in a portable chair on the front walk and watched with the very serious expression he wore whenever he was observing something he didn't yet understand, but intended to figure out. The neighbors' kids were doing something across the street. A bike was involved. Someone was yelling in the good way. It was a Saturday afternoon, 4 o'clock or so, and the light was the particular quality of late spring in the Midwest, everything slightly gold, everything slightly provisional the way spring light is before summer arrives and settles into something less conditional. Liam put a fistful of grass in his mouth. Jake said his name, he looked up and grinned with his whole face the way he does, and the grass fell out. Dana got out 14 months early. I hope her attorneys were worth it.